Clara Crane was born in Texas in 1871. She married an older man named Leonard, and they had one child, a little girl, and they named her Marcella. The three of them lived on a farm on the outskirts of Terrell, Texas. In 1893, when little Marcella was only 5 years old, she went out into the fields with her father while he worked. She was killed in a farming accident, and Clara found out that he had been drinking at the time of the accident. Clara was devastated. She became withdrawn and despondent. And 2 years later, she was still stricken with grief, and she decided to take revenge. She blamed her husband for her daughter's death. She poisoned him by lacing a few caramels, his favorite candy. The next day, a neighbor came by to check on Clara, and she noticed that Clara was in what she called a shaken and frenzied state. So her neighbor called the police, and when they arrived, Clara became aggressive towards the sheriff. As he was looking through the house, he found her husband's body. Clara was put on trial for first-degree murder, but she was found insane and was sent to the North Texas Lunatic Asylum, now known as the Terrell State Hospital. A doctor noted that staff found a doll that Clara had made from torn bedsheets, and she hid it in her room. The doll's name was Marcy, which was her daughter's nickname. Other patients also told the staff that she would talk and sing to the doll at night. Clara allegedly wrote this letter about the doll to her sister. The letter said, "Dearest Aggie, I am elated. I have been informed by Dr. Matthews that Marcy and I will be returning home in less than 3 weeks. As you can imagine, Marcy can barely contain her excitement. Every night she asks,
'Is tomorrow the day when we go home, Mother?'
Very soon, I will be able to tell her, yes. Our story here has been somewhat of a trial, though I have been grateful to the good doctor and his staff in their dedication to our treatment and recovery. Leonard's death had put us in such a severe state of melancholy that I feared we would never escape it. These past few years have been more difficult than any in my life, and my dear Marcella, after all that she has had to endure, has become my strength, my flame of hope." Signed, Clara Crane. Clara was said to be charming and soft-spoken and was considered a good candidate for release. So in 1899, she was released due to overcrowding. There wasn't aftercare in those days, so no one knows what happened to her after that. This is where the urban legend of the Candy Lady begins. Shortly after Clara was released, 8 children went missing near her home in Terrell, Texas. People in the area were understandably very worried. The adults could not figure out how these children were disappearing until some of the older children fessed up and told their parents that sometimes when they would wake up, they'd find candy sitting on their windowsill. There would be a message attached that said, "Can you come out to play?" The message would be written on the candy wrapper or a piece of paper, and it would always be signed, "The Candy Lady." The children were worried that if they said anything, the Candy Lady would stop bringing them candy, so they kept the secret for years. People started to remember the lady who killed her husband with candy, so they came to the conclusion that Clara might just be behind all of this. One day, a farmer who was working in his fields found a candy wrapper on the ground. When he picked it up, he said that it was filled with rotten children's teeth. He immediately notified the sheriff. The sheriff came to investigate, but he too would disappear during this investigation. This, of course, scared the town even more. After about 2 weeks, the sheriff's body was found. He had been brutally beaten to death, and he was thrown in the bank of the river. There were forks stabbed into his eyes, and his pockets were stuffed with candy. The Candy Lady was again under suspicion. To this day, whenever a child goes missing, the locals say the Candy Lady got them. Children also believe that she will take them somewhere and pull out their teeth or stab them with a fork. A cemetery in Stull, Kansas is known in paranormal circles as being a site that's associated with unexplained phenomena, the devil, and the occult. It's also a place that some claim is one of the 7 portals to hell. It's about an hour away from the Sally House, which is a very well-known, supposedly haunted house. The cemetery in Stull, Kansas was also the setting for the 5th season finale of the show Supernatural. The creator of Supernatural actually chose Lawrence, Kansas to be the Winchester's hometown because of how close it is to Stull. It's only about 10 to 12 miles from Lawrence. There used to be an old church there. According to legend, in the basement of that former church, there was supposedly a staircase. The steps were said to be nearly impossible to find and were covered by a hidden seal that would only open on Halloween and the spring equinox, which is March the 20th. If a person descended that staircase, they would allegedly reach the entrance to hell. If you were able to climb back up those steps, you would be climbing for weeks. Some of those that have descended the steps often disappeared and were reported missing only to return weeks later. But to them, no time had even passed. Visitors have noticed that according to their watches, they've spent several hours in the cemetery, but they don't remember any of it. There are rumors that an old tree that used to be in the graveyard was once used to hang a witch. It's said that one of the graves in the cemetery is that of a child whose father was the devil and his mother was a witch. The child was so deformed that he only lived for a few days. And as I mentioned, the devil allegedly visits the cemetery and this particular grave every Halloween at midnight. A story about Stull allegedly appeared in Time magazine in the 90s. It claimed that Pope John Paul II refused to fly over Stull while he was on his way to a public appearance in Colorado. This was because the Pope didn't want to fly over unholy ground. The legends also say that the devil has been visiting Stull since the 1850s and that the original name of the town was Skull, but was changed to Stull to hide the fact that the town was involved in black magic. The urban legend of Stull, Kansas can be traced back to an article in the November 1974 issue of the University Daily Kansan, which is a student newspaper at the University of Kansas. The article was actually meant to just be something spooky for their Halloween edition, but because of a paper shortage, it was printed almost a week after Halloween. This caused the story to take on a life of its own, and an urban legend was born. The article was titled, "Legend of Devil Haunts Tiny Town," and it claimed that at midnight the devil chose two places to visit every Halloween. One of those places was Stull, Kansas, and the other was on the desolate plain of India. The truth about Stull, Kansas is that it's a very tiny town. It never went by the name Skull. It used to go by the name Deer Creek. And the Stull family was the largest family in Deer Creek, and their first postmaster was named Sylvester Stull. One real tragedy in the town occurred when a 2-year-old boy named Oliver was accidentally killed when his father was burning the crops to make the soil fertile. Another person who had gone missing was later found by a search party hanging in a tree. During the spring equinox in 1978, more than 150 people waited in the cemetery for a chance to see the devil. Years later, once the legend had grown, over 500 people visited the cemetery that night. Inconsiderate ghost hunters and trespassers have even knocked over headstones where the residents' loved ones are buried. The town has had it with trespassers and vandals, and I don't blame them. Today there is a chain link fence around the cemetery that is closely monitored by law enforcement. Trespassing can get you a $1,000 fine and up to 6 months in jail. The few residents that remain in Stull, or about 20 people, are beyond tired of such ridiculous things being said about their town. Melonheads are said to live in the forests of Michigan, Connecticut, and Ohio, but I'll only be talking about the legend in Ohio. There are two popular legends of how they came to be, and they both involve a Dr. Crow. One legend says the government was responsible for doing experiments on children which resulted in their large heads. They were then sent to Kirtland, Ohio, because they didn't have anywhere else to send them. They showed up at Dr. Crow's house in the middle of the night, and he and his wife took care of them. The other legend says that Dr. Crow performed experiments on the children by injecting chemicals into their brain. Some people say he injected water into their brains. This caused their heads to grow to a grotesquely deformed size, and this is how they got the name Melonheads. Whatever the doctor did to the children caused them to become mentally ill, and after they were experimented on for years, they killed Dr. Crow and his wife, and they burned down his facility. Since they didn't have anywhere else to go, they lived in the woods, and some believed that they could still be out there. And most sightings tend to occur at night. This tree is known as the Devil's Tree, and legend says the KKK used the tree to lynch runaway slaves. Another legend says one day a farmer who became depressed after a very barren season took his family on a picnic beneath the tree, and he killed them all with an axe. Out of grief, he then hanged himself, and for hours his body swayed side to side in the breeze. And today some claim to see the silhouette of a hanging man. Allegedly, anyone who tries to cut down this tree or steal its bark will come to an untimely end. This could be a car accident, visual and auditory hallucinations, or even death. Because of this, the base of the tree is wrapped in a chain-link fence. Legend also says that the tree produces an abnormal amount of heat, and that even in the dead of winter, no snow will fall around it. People have claimed to hear children screaming when you press your ear to the tree's bark, and the branch that is closest to the ground is said to be the hanging branch. On September the 4th, 1954, Santiago Airlines Flight 513 departed from West Germany for Brazil. The flight should have taken around 18 hours. The plane stopped in Lisbon, Portugal to refuel, then it continued on towards its destination. Somewhere over the Atlantic, however, the plane just vanished. For weeks, search parties looked for any sign of the missing plane, but there was nothing. There was no wreckage, no bodies, no survivors. It was as if the plane had simply vanished into thin air. 35 years later, on October the 12th, 1989, without contacting the air traffic controllers, the plane was spotted circling the Brazilian airport, where it eventually made a successful landing. It landed at the airport just fine, as if nothing had happened. But once the ground crew approached the airplane, they stopped. The aircraft was full of skeletons. The pilot's hands were still on the controls, and the engine was still running. The pilots, the passengers, the flight attendants, they were all just dry bones with no indication as to what had happened. So, what did happen? One theory is that the plane was abducted by aliens. Some people believe this because there was no record of the plane or its occupants in the years between their disappearances. Another theory is that the plane was caught in a time warp, being that it reappeared exactly 30 years after it disappeared. Could it have entered into some other dimension? Some believe that as well. There are a few cases of airplanes that have actually disappeared without a trace, with the most famous being the Malaysia Airlines 370, which vanished in 2014. The story of Santiago Flight 513 sounds a lot like the Odyssey of Flight 33, which is an episode of The Twilight Zone. The plane travels back in time. The reappearance of Santiago Flight 513 is one of the most mysterious events in aviation history. The only problem is that Santiago Airlines never existed. This fake story was published in the tabloid Weekly World News. Alvin Schwartz, the author of Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, also wrote another book called In a Dark, Dark Room and Other Scary Stories. If you grew up in the 80s or 90s like me, you may have read it. It's a very simple but creepy short story about a girl that always wore a green ribbon around her neck. The story, however, had a very macabre and historical origin. In the story, there's a little girl named Jenny that's just like any other girl, except for the fact that she always wore a green ribbon around her neck. She never took it off. So one day, while she was at the park, she's hanging out with her classmate Alfred. He really liked Jenny, and she really liked him. He asked her, why does she always wear that ribbon around her neck? She said, I cannot tell you. Alfred just kept asking, why do you wear it? She would just tell him that it wasn't important. Eventually, the two of them grew up, fell in love, and they got married. Alfred figured that finally we are now husband and wife, and you can tell me why you always wear this ribbon. She told him that he still had to wait, but she would tell him when the time was right. As the years passed and they grew older, Jenny became deathly ill and she didn't have much longer to live. So as Alfred was sitting by her bed, she told him that she could finally tell him about the green ribbon. She told him, she said, untie it and you will see why I could not tell you before. So Alfred slowly unties the ribbon and Jenny's head falls off. The green ribbon dates back to at least 1824 with Washington Irving's short story, The Adventure of the German Student. In the 1790s, during the French Revolution, there were gatherings or balls, and they were believed to have been organized by the relatives of those that were killed by the guillotine. It was a way to reconnect with other survivors of what was called the Reign of Terror. Almost 17,000 people were killed by guillotine in a single year. These balls were known as victims' balls, and it's where attendees would cut their hair in the same manner that guillotine victims were given prior to execution. These victims actually inspired fashion. Chokers, ripped corsets, and short tangled hair all symbolized death by guillotine. Young women would cut their hair short to resemble guillotine victims, so their full necks were exposed, as a guillotine victim's neck would be prior to execution. Their hair was cut short so the blade could easily remove their head. They also wore red chokers to symbolize where the blade of the guillotine would have severed the heads of their relative. And to enter the ball, guests would jerk their heads down sharply to imitate the moment of decapitation.